When the town of Wilton was less than 60 years old in 1885, the guy who was probably the most famous person in America, maybe in the world, the guy who had saved the Union and become a two-term president of this great new country called America, he came here to Mount McGregor because he was dying and he was broke. So Grant worked with Mark Twain, another famous author at that time, to publish his histories of his generalship during the Civil War, because in this way he could overcome poverty and cheat death by actually, after selling 350,000 copies, his wife got the equivalent in today's money of $11 million. So we like to think that Ulysses S. Grant came to Mount McGregor and won his final battle, a final battle over poverty and throat cancer. Ulysses S. Grant was broke because his son got him into a Ponzi scheme, and he lost all his money. Grant Cottage reenactor Steve Trim describes the early process of drafting his memoirs before he came to Wilton.
The beginning, before the cancer really took hold, it's cancer of the mouth, the throat, the tongue, I could dictate, and I sat and told stories about my family history, the Mexican War, the Civil War, and the stenographer wrote everything down. I just spun the stories and had no particular plan at all. And I think that perhaps to a degree irritated my editor, Mark Twain, because he was an editor. He knew some stories were better than others, so I left it to him to do the editing. I basically threw in everything I could remember.
1885 was a terrible year for the Grant family, and longtime volunteer Steve Trim tells us why Grant came to Mount McGregor to finish his memoirs despite suffering from terminal throat cancer.
My wife and I were living in New York City. That is where I was diagnosed with cancer. By the spring of 1885, as I said, most of the book was done, but not quite. And my doctors believed that if I stayed in the city, there was a heat wave coming, that the conditions would so aggravate my medical condition that I might be pushed right over the edge. So they looked around for a place with fresh, clean, unpolluted air. The theory being if they could relocate me, the new environment would prolong my life and I would have time to finish the book. My friend, Joseph Drexel, owned a cottage on Mount McGregor in the town of Wilton, New York. He offered the cottage to the family and to me for free for as long as we might need it, and that's why we came to Wilton in 1885.
Grant died just days after completing his memoirs on Mount McGregor, and this image is the last photograph ever taken of the American icon on the porch of what was then called Drexel Cottage.
When Mark Twain, my publisher, came here, he was encouraging me to accelerate the process of ending the book, but my family urged me to go slow because they saw in my focus on the writing and my devotion to the project that it was actually prolonging my life. It was giving me something to live for, and I don't disagree. Well, my whole family was here. It had been years since the entire family was together. It's my 4 adult children, my grandchildren, and in a way, it was one of the happiest times of my life because we were all together and we could look back over the years together and the wonderful family adventures we had had together. So in a sense, I was in physical pain, but emotionally, I'm not sure I've ever been happier.
When Grant died on Mount McGregor, there was a funeral at the cottage, and then the train that brought him here took him back down the mountain through Saratoga Springs and to Albany. Here's an image from August 6th of 1885 as the general's coffin was taken up State Street, where a viewing of the body would occur in the newly built State Capitol building up at the top of the hill. Then the train took Grant down to New York City, where on the 8th of August, the biggest procession in American history was staged over a 7-mile section of Broadway to the East River, where we now have Grant's tomb. After U.S. Grant left Mount McGregor, the cottage became a hallowed site, where groups of Civil War veterans would pitch tents to protect the place where the great man died from souvenir hunters and looters. In 1897, the 100-room Balmoral Hotel at the summit was destroyed by fire, and many thought that was the last chapter to be written in the history of the mountain. But in 1913, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company purchased 1,200 acres of Mount McGregor to build a tuberculosis sanitarium for up to 350 patients. In 1945, New York State purchased the facility from Metropolitan to take care of convalescing veterans returning from the battles of World War II. In 1960, the state converted many of the buildings to house the developmentally disabled. And then, in 1976, the complex was converted into a prison called the Mount McGregor Correctional Facility. In July of 2014, Mount McGregor Prison was closed and was put up for sale. And while some interest has been shown in privatizing the 325-acre prison property, its future remains uncertain.